In Deuteronomy 29, Moses recounts extraordinary occurrences and blessings that have been, in some respects, so reliable during the desert wanderings of Israel, the mass of people have come to believe these blessings to be inevitable. The recitation of stories of God's miracles is a persistent pattern in the Bible. It also permeates the Book of Mormon. It has always been the responsibility of prophetic record keepers to chronicle and recollect miraculous blessings to the blessed. A long, long time ago, I was studying the Old Testament in graduate school. It was there I was taught to recognize this pattern of frequent repetition of the wondrous stories documenting God's loving interventions in the lives of his chosen people. These oft-repeated recorded interventions are called the sacred history. I can still remember how it made me smile to recognize the pattern and rhythm of sacred histories recounted in the scriptures. Eventually, I realized that tradition was perpetuated in the Book of Mormon. It was a bit like breaking another piece of code designed to confirm that the Book of Mormon was indeed an ancient canonical collection of histories and spiritual experiences. It is one of so many scriptural patterns, like the poetic style chiasmus, or the kinds of names and places, or the cycles of poverty, persistence, prosperity, pride, and then the fall from peace and well-being described in the Book of Mormon text that startle us into appreciating the recognizable style of not only writing, but living that harmonizes the Book of Mormon with the Old Testament. These similarities point to the astonishing revelation of another inspired book that bears witness to Jesus' divine mission and God's love for all his children. Rereading the firm but loving admonitions of Moses to the children of Israel at this moment of great transition in their lives reminded me forcefully of the story of my own mother's journey through the wilderness. In America, after surviving the horror and hell that was the Holocaust, my mother began to search many paths, looking for a way to understand why she had been preserved from death and what was the purpose of life. Years after he was murdered by the Nazis, my mother received a letter of warning from her father. Years after the war had ended and she was raising her young family here in America, my mother had already been independently and powerfully impressed that Jesus was the promised Messiah. Now, she struggled to reconcile her conviction with the stunning appearance of this miraculous letter from her beloved father, found within a precious heirloom Haggadah, or Jewish book of prayers for Passover. Inexplicably, it arrived on our doorstep in Millbrae, California, a few days after Christmas in 1958. The prescient message inscribed therein, written in the spring of 1939, contained warnings and admonitions from my grandfather to his almost 8-year-old daughter. My beloved daughter, Agika, I sense dark clouds are gathering over our heads at this time, clouds I cannot disperse. In the storm that is to come, I fear the fire of your faith in God may be extinguished. I am concerned I will not be by your side to rekindle this faith. My prayer is that if you feel your commitment to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob wavering, if you feel your faith weakening as you weather the trials ahead, you will remember the miracles the Jewish people have witnessed throughout their recorded history. Please think back on the faithfulness of our people to God through the ages and the sacrifices they have made to remain faithful. Realize if you break faith with them, if you forsake your devotion to the God who covenanted with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then all your forebears will have suffered in vain. All the wealth and property of my mother's family had been stolen or destroyed. Yet somehow, this powerful last testament of my grandfather not only endured, but made its way across the ocean to find my young mother. In the letter, my grandfather recounts God's miracles and scriptures to his daughter and urgently admonishes her to remain true. My mother was deeply moved, but also deeply troubled. How could she reconcile this posthumous plea of her father, which had reached her across the chasm of death, with her newfound faith in Jesus Christ? The answer came to her while reading the words of the Book of Mormon given to her by our adopted Uncle Sterling and Auntie Edna Wheelwright. In my mother's own words, I suffered much over the seemingly irreconcilable conflict with which my father's last wish confronted me. How could I remain loyal to the God of Israel when I knew that Jesus was the God and Redeemer of this world, and that I myself had found redemption and a more abundant life in him? In the depth of my despair, I turned once more to God, and he sent me a messenger in the form of my loyal friend Edna. She came one day and brought me the Book of Mormon. After she had left, I picked it up and began to read. I was struck right on the first page when I read that the book was intended for the Jews. I opened the book at random and began to read. I was amazed to find that it was all about Jews and the house of Israel. I opened it in another place. The same familiar style prevailed, describing a relationship between a people and God, which is so unique to Judaism and which I remembered reading about when I was very young. In some religions, God is remote and passive. He is raised far above the noise and sweat of daily living. He must be worshipped on such lofty heights that the average human being usually needs a mediator in the form of priests and ministers to get to him. It was only in these two books that I encountered a God so easily accessible, one with whom discussion and exchange were possible, and who himself is as much concerned about our actions as we are about his. Yet there remained a missing link for me. Granted, the God of the Old Testament and the God of the Book of Mormon were one and the same. Where did Jesus come into the picture? It was Jesus to whom I felt a personal loyalty and love, far above anything I had ever felt toward the God of my fathers. Then I stumbled upon this passage in the Book of Mormon. Behold, I am he that gave the law to Moses, and I am he who covenanted with my people Israel. Therefore the law in me is fulfilled, for I have come to fulfill the law. Therefore it hath an end. Reading these words of Jesus on his brief visit to the American continent, my mother suddenly realized that her father's God, Jehovah, and the God she worshiped, Jesus, were one and the same. She could be true to her father's admonishment to be faithful to the God of their fathers and to herself by joining the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She observed then, I am content that I have done my own share in the linking up of generations. I have not snapped the chain which my ancestors forged with their blood and their suffering. I have faith that after me, my children will continue to serve the living God. In Deuteronomy 29, Moses realizes his journey is almost done. He warns his flock that the consequences of abandoning their covenants with the Lord may not be immediate, but they will be sure and they will be scathing. These consequences will occur because they have forsaken the covenant of the Lord God of their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them forth out of the land of Egypt. For they went and served other gods and worshiped them, gods whom they knew not and whom he had not given them. It must be, how can it not be a bittersweet duty to lay out for those who have either followed him into the desert or their descendants and others who have become part of this massive traveling menagerie, the deliverance they have experienced over and over again from certain death and suffocating sin, whether walking once upon a time through the sea on dry land, or gathering manna for sustenance every single morning, whether defeating armies or simply looking up to a symbol held aloft to heal from a plague, whether, like their sandals and cloaks, they have endured to the end of their journey to the Holy Land, promised them, or have expired in the process of pressing on, these people have been part of a miraculous movement from slavery to freedom. It is the same movement children of God are still part of today, moving from the slavery of sin to the freedom that flows from obedience to the principles and commandments of the gospel. As I read this account of the promises God made to those who honored him and the litany of the emotional or actual wasteland that ultimately awaits those who would choose to ignore God's truths, I thought of the extraordinary promise and warning conveyed to my mother across the chasm of death by her kind and faithful father, Sebastian Tilleman. We each individually and as families have a sacred history of miracles, wonders, and blessings that deserve to be recorded and repeated. As we do so again and again, this evidence of God's involvement in our lives and in the lives of those who have come before us will be available to those we love now and in the future. My grandfather's letter to my mother miraculously survived the destruction of almost everything my grandfather had acquired in this life: his homes, his business, his gold and jewels, even his life. But that one letter in that one book was vastly more valuable than any other inheritance he could have left his daughter and his granddaughters.